All right. Thank you so much for being here today. We have very special guests today for the second webinar series for social justice in digital age. We have Claske Dijkema. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing it correctly. And Pedro Varela. Thank you so much for being here. Just before, well, welcome, of course. But before we start, I just wanted to share a little bit of information about how the webinar is going to run. So the seminar we will have 20 to 25 minutes for Claske to present her research, her amazing research, I would say, on violence in marginalized and racialized urban settings in France. And then Pedro will provide a comment on the presentation, and hopefully by the end of the session we'll have more or less 40 minutes for debate if everyone agrees. Before Claske starts, let me just provide a brief summary of Klaske's bio. So Claske is a Marie Curie Fellow at SwissPeace and part-time lecturer at the University of Basel, or Basel. Is it Basel? Maybe
Depends
Basel.
where you are.
She works with the geographies of peace approach applied to European cities confronted with the aftermaths of recurrent episodes of violence. During her PhD research, she developed a decolonial approach to marginalized social housing neighborhoods in France that deal with urban violence in particular. From autumn 2023 onwards, so quite recent, she pursues her interest in conflicts, empowerments and safety in urban spaces at the Bern University of Applied Sciences in Switzerland. Thank you so much, Claske, for being here today presenting your work, and I will give you all the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sylvia. So I will start with a quick introduction to how I came to my observations that I will share in a more formalized way, because I presented the text. But just to tell you that I come from peace and conflict studies, the area in which I worked in for a long time before starting my PhD in the area of human geography. And I came to these ideas because working on peace and conflict studies for a long time, I wondered why actually is the focus of so much peace and conflict studies focused on the global south, as if we in the north in Europe, as if we don't have any conflicts. And then at the time when the nationwide riots broke out in 2005, I was actually in South Africa, interested in the South African context in which I lived. And then people were asking me about, but what is happening there? You know, it's on fire, it's so dangerous. And then really being confronted with the view from the outside of what it looks like. And so then I got interested in applying a conflict transformation approach more to the issue of urban violence in France, as also a way of reversing the gaze. And if we say that these tools of conflict transformation are so wonderful to work with in the global south or in context of armed violence, why not use it here? And I think there's also a lot of resistance against seeing urban violence in terms of a conflict, because if something is a conflict, then we know a lot of things what we do with it. You take into account also the aggressor. You have to sit around the table. And so I came to see framing something only as violence also legitimizes a whole terms of ways of dealing with it, which is much more militarized. And so that's where my interest in this topic came from. But then actually when I started my PhD in 2015, the week I started the terrorist attacks against Charlie Hebdo took place. And because I wanted to work with participant action and doing action research, the whole topic of urban violence went to the background, and terrorism and counterterrorism and Islamophobia then became much more at the center, and so I followed a bit the debates in the neighborhood in which I worked, and we went very much into questions around like why are we treated so differently, and looking at the colonial past. And so during my postdoc at SwissPeace in Switzerland, I came back to these original questions. And I try, so in this paper, I will really focus on this tense relationship between police and youth, which I see as a conflict, which is kind of, it's violence that erupts every now and again. And then I mentioned 2005 as a point, but actually, of course, there's a new kind of breaking point which took place in this spring. But I will focus on one specific area, which is the area of Villeneuve, which is a marginalized neighborhood in France, in a city called Grenoble, where I was doing my research. And what is also important to know is that the geography faculty is really just across from this neighborhood. So the neighborhood and the faculty are like physically so close, but still they're quite different worlds that I tried to bring together in this research. And so I will present here a kind of a decolonial and feminist approach to understanding urban violence in France and the strained relationships with the police. So this presentation approaches urban violence, which in this context mainly means setting objects on fire and thereby provoking police intervention and altercation as a form of self-defense by the subaltern. Youth use the body rather than words to make a statement. I draw on Elsa Dorlin to explain that if the subalterns are not considered worth defending by those in power, physical violence is one of the few tools they have to defend their dignity. And youth, so the media is responsible for the hyper-visibilization of this violence, as if it's the only thing to report about what is happening in these neighborhoods. And then youth turn this hyper-visibilization of urban violence by mainstream media into a tool in order to publicize their anger. So there is really a relationship, it's not one-dimensional between these different actors, which I try to understand. So they chose fire as a means of public address, not because they're not capable of speaking, but because they refuse the interlocution. They refuse to make statements and to make clear demands. Because if one has the feeling that one is not heard, violence, in this case, setting objects on fire, can become a viable option. And so while the established may well require that post-colonial immigrants and inhabitants of marginalized neighborhoods ask for their rights, politely and patiently wait for their demands to be taken into account, eruptions of violence are only to be expected if the established are perceived to be unwilling to listen and refuse to recognize the subaltern as legitimate political adversaries. So the riots that took place in Grenoble in 2010 serve as an empirical grounding of this argument. And so here you can see the neighborhood of Villeneuve, and the picture is taken from my office in the geography faculty. So it also shows the proximity. And so in July 2010, important riots broke out in Villeneuve, a marginalized social housing neighborhood in the southern part of Grenoble, as I mentioned. And they followed a pattern that has become very familiar in France, starting with the death of a racialized young man from a marginalized neighborhood as the result of a police intervention. In many cases, such deaths provoke acts of destruction and setting objects of fire, leading to a police intervention. So there is this cat and mouse game where if an object is set on fire, youth know that the fireman cannot intervene without being accompanied by the police. So setting an object on fire is also a way of drawing in the police and provoking this confrontation. So confrontations generally last for a couple of days, but can last longer, as has been the case in 2005, when riots lasted for a month and spread throughout the entire country. In Villeneuve, the riots that broke out in 2010 lasted 3 nights. What sparked these riots was the death of Karim Bouddouda, who was tracked by the police after he had robbed a casino, which you can see here, with his partner in crime in a wealthy town not far from Grenoble. He was then shot in Villeneuve at the foot of the block where his mother lived. Bouddouda was hit in the back by a bullet after he fired at the police. That night, a group of about 30 young men went out on the streets to express their anger about his death, burning roughly 75 cars, breaking the glass of the neighborhood's tram stops, throwing stones at the police and the firemen, and setting fire to street furniture. So I analyze the image that has become symbolic of the 2010 riots in Villeneuve as an example of the hypervisibilization of violence. And I use the theoretical input of Haraway's idea of constructed visibility, Butler's analysis of inverted projections, and Dorlin's input on violent subjects acting out of self-defense to analyze the interaction between speaking through acts of violence, silencing practices, and the hypervisibilization of violence. They help to answer the question, what is actually urban about urban violence? Violence becomes an option in a context where the use of words does not make sense for those who lack access to the channels of verbal expression. If they cannot make themselves heard, what does lie in their power is the ability to make themselves visible and to do harm. This approach to urban violence breaks with the common interpretation that violence is a sign of anomia, of powerlessness, and of a desperate act to exist in some way. Since rioters know that their voices will not be heard, most of them do not even try to speak and choose instead silence. A post-colonial reading of riots leads Pietre to the conclusion that it was not an incapacity to speak, but a refusal of interlocution that characterized the 2005 riots in France. It is because rioters understand that they cannot speak in the sense of spivak, that they choose alternative means of communication. They choose to speak in terms of acts, bodily acts, rather than words. So what is urban about this violence that is called urban is that it uses physical space strategically to provoke direct confrontations with the police and to make a public statement. The act of setting something on fire has an important performative function. It produces spectacular images that make visible feelings of anger and revolt. Those involved in urban riots use the hypervisibilization of violence by the mainstream media, as I mentioned, to publicize their anger. I consider the burning of cars, tires, garbage bins, schools as smoke signals. Hence, fire becomes a means of public address. The only space available to publicize their anger is urban public space. It is there that their public address can meet its audience. Cars, street furniture, and walls for graffiti statements are used in July 2010 to express anger about this death of Karim Bouddouda. This message, or these messages, target security forces, but address a larger audience. The chosen location for the exhibition of flames, a parking lot at the edge of the neighborhood, should be taken into account. 3 reasons may have played a role in the choice of this location. It was here that Bouddouda was shot. A car park is a logical place to burn cars, and the parking area functions as a transition zone between what is considered to be inside and outside of the neighborhood. A statement made on the border of the neighborhood is most likely addressed to those outside of it, but from a space that is considered theirs. The political impact of these smoke signals is, however, limited because rioters have little influence on the interpretations of these events. And these expressions of anger mostly lead to the strengthening of the security discourse and to measures that negatively affect racialized inhabitants of marginalized neighborhoods. The hypervisibilization of urban violence in mainstream media simultaneously leads to silencing and to making this publicized anger incomprehensible. The problem for the racialized is that they are seen all the time because they are made visible as others, but they are not heard. According to Haraway, vision is always partial and provisional, culturally produced and performed, and it depends on the spaces of constructed visibility that, even as they claim to render the opacities of other spaces transparent, they're always also spaces of constructed invisibility. And so it's this play between visibility and invisibility that I'm interested in. And it is specific of racism that those that are imagined or pictured are in reality the objects of a design that has little to do with them in first instance. The image of the riots in Villeneuve is such an example. While it has come to represent Villeneuve to a certain extent, the neighborhood's inhabitants feel it has little to do with them. I consider that these images are a means to disqualify acts or statements in public space and are therefore a form of epistemic violence. To make this argument, I draw on Butler's concept of inverted projections that transform the meaning of voices and acts through racist representations. The empirical case on which Butler builds the conceptual tool of inverted projections is the Rodney King case in 1995, in which physical defense was interpreted as an act of aggression. Inverted projections focus on the visual rather than on the discursive domain of representation. They deal with an image, a projection, of an act that comes to represent the reality. In the interpretation of this image by the established, the intentions behind an act, which in the case of Rodney King was he held up his hands in order to, out of self-defense, but in the trial and in the case, this was presented by the prosecution or by those who were defending the policeman as a symbol that he was dangerous. And so because it was interpreted as an act of aggression. So in the interpretation of this image by the established, the intentions behind an act of a marginalized and subaltern person are not only made inaudible, but the intentions of the aggressor and victim are being inverted. The victim becomes the aggressor. The idea of inverted projections helps, therefore, to understand the way in which racialized bodies in danger come to be seen as sources of danger. The image of riots in Villeneuve is not the object of an inverted projection as such, because the young man's hands in the center of the picture are not raised in self-defense, as in the case of Rodney King. The other two men next to him are throwing objects in the direction of the police. Seeing them as aggressors is therefore not only the projection of white paranoia. However, what this image has in common with the footage of the raised hands of Rodney King is that it suffers from the effects of the frozen frame, of using an image taken at one moment in time to portray a whole situation. Butler's observation that the raised hand is torn from its temporal place in the visual narrative is applicable here. In this case, the image comes to speak for the 2010 riots and Villeneuve as a whole, because you will see for a long time, as long as you entered Villeneuve, it was very much on Google, it was very much associated to this image. But it doesn't say anything about what happened prior to this moment. In other words, what this image brings into visibility leaves out of visibility other aspects of what happened that evening. of Karim Bourouda being shot by the police, of being shot in his back, of his body being left unattended for over 6 hours, and the much more structural tensions around police conduct in marginalized neighborhoods. The frozen frame reinforces the representation of urban violence as senseless or barbaric, and has the function of a bestialization of the crowds, as did the frozen frame in the Rodney King case. So the decontextualization of this image by the mainstream media was subsequently recontextualized by the French president. And so here you see a close-up of this image, and here you see the statements that it then led to. Each event of violence leads to a whole new kind of almost how do I say that, an overflow of state discourse. So it was recontextualized by the French president, explaining the riots in 2010 as a problem of immigration and integration. And he was blaming the parents for not properly educating their children, and had a lot of proposals around also punishing parents whose children were violent, like taking away their benefits. So this political treatment of the riots in 2010 meant that 20 or 30 people, the estimated number of young people that participated in the riots, came to speak for an entire neighborhood, while other voices were made inaudible. While visibilizing violence, media did not capture the alternative and everyday prefigurative politics that are going on in the neighborhood and that inhabitants are engaged in. While urban violence is interpreted by the established as an attack on the Republic, it is interpreted by many in the neighborhood as an act of defense, a physical defense. The sentiment is widespread in the neighborhood that the state either abandons the neighborhood or represents an oppressive force. Dorlin explains that if the subalterns are not considered worth defending by those in power, physical violence is one of the tools they have left to defend their dignity. Violence of subalterns can therefore be reinterpreted as an act of self-defense. In the case of 2010, rioting and entering into violent confrontation with the police should not be seen as an act of individual physical self-defense, but as the defense of their neighborhood and the defense of their dignity. So in this presentation, I analyzed urban violence as subaltern violence and focused on the dynamics between speaking through violent acts and being made visible and being made inaudible. I've demonstrated that at the same time as subalternized rioters are brought into the field of visual representation, they are maneuvered beyond the range of hearing. Subalterns are not mere victims, though. They adopt tactics that use the visual attention that is drawn to their physical appearance, such as skin color. They use this visibility to publicize their anger. I argue that rioters have developed a means of public address adapted to this condition of the subaltern and to this age of the image and social networks. Media do the work of widely distributing the images produced by angry young people. They use this visibility that media provide to make public statements to publicize their frustration and anger. And I think I will leave it to that for the moment. Later on in the discussion, I can tell a bit more on more generally why I consider that people in these neighborhoods, why this situation also can be seen as a form of why we can think about conflict as in this non-war setting and what it means to the lived experience of people. But I first look forward to the comments by Pedro.
Thank you so much, Claske. Pedro, can I ask you to comment in more or less 15 minutes? I realize I didn't set a time for you. Is that okay?
Yeah, yes. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Hello, everyone. First, I want to thank you for your presentation, Claske. I learned a lot with your work and research, and I also like to thank the organization for inviting me, namely Annabelle, Maria João, and Sylvia, all the team, and all the teams from the projects who are connected with these seminars or webinars. I will bring some thoughts, comments, and questions based on your presentation, this one, but also in the article that the organization sent to me that you wrote with Eric Jontu, I believe I'm saying right, the geographies of peace in the wake of non-war violence in the city, which was very interesting for me. It's a very interesting this article and your presentation, and how you analyze the paroxysmal violence in the analysis of violence in France. And I also believe when you speak in France, it's also about the European or the European Union context countries, and how you try to widen the empirical scope of peace and conflict studies to non-war cities. And you were talking about that now, that you will speak more about that. This is a kind of new field of analysis for me, so I've learned a lot with your work. First of all, I'd like to say that the reality of police violence in France, and specifically the riots in the suburbs of French cities in 2005, was a trigger for me back in the time as a young student and activist to start to think about the reality of racism and police violence and also segregation in Lisbon. For me, this was not what was happening in France. For me, was a trigger to start to think what was the reality of racism in the periphery of Lisbon. Now I will bring some thoughts, comments, and questions on your work. The first one, I'd like you to elaborate more on the reality of the racialized population you describe in your work in Villeneuve, or the two Villeneuve you speak about. I believe you're speaking about young people from Arab origin, from North African, Muslim background, also Black people. And I would like for you to describe more this racialized reality that you work. Another question or comment, I would also like you to speak more about how the state violence, and namely the racist police brutality, influences the violence, and this is specific for your article that you wrote, how the state violence and the police brutality influences the violence between groups of young people, and specifically, of course, the marginalized young people. Another question, and you already speak again, and in your article you speak about that, and for us in Europe, I think it's very interesting, and comparing the reality in France and Portugal, it's very important. It's how the colonial control strategies from the past, that were used by the colonial powers in the colonies, how this colonial control then is passing to the urban reality that we live in our countries, and how this colonial control from the past is targeting the racialized people in France, but in other places, if you know. This is, I think it's quite interesting, given that in Portugal, for example, this also happened. And as an example, if we see Portugal, the Police Intervention Corps that was created in 1977, it was created, and this is the more violent police, it was created with people, resources, and experience accumulated from the extinct police forces from Angola and Mozambique. And I would like you to, because I read in your article, you didn't develop in depth in the article or now this, but I know I really want you to speak about this reality of the strategies that were used in colonial context are used today against racialized people in the cities in Europe. And now I have also some questions about the fieldwork methodology, and for me this is very important also, and also for you, Claude. In your paper, Geographies of Peace, you show how you replace traditional interviews with the organization participation and taking part in public debates. And then I believe you made some interviews after, but your focus was to look and organize these debates about violence. And I would like you to develop more about how did you work with this. Still on methodology, I would like you to comment on the use in your article. You use the pseudonyms of the interviewed people, and you write, since you write, you follow ethical guidelines of the University of Basel, despite interviews' preferences for using their real first name. And it seems that you didn't really agree with the use of pseudonyms. And how did the participants in their interviews react to the change of their names to pseudonyms? And this for me, it's also a question, because many times we write PhD theses and papers, and we know that the people sometimes want their names in our work. And then there is all these questions of using names, if we don't use names before or not. And I want you to speak a little bit about the use of pseudonyms in your work. I have 10 minutes, yes?
More like 7.
7, okay, I'll do it 3, I think.
But it's okay if you have more ideas.
Yeah, I'll speak after again. With regard to using approaches to analyzing violence in non-war zones that are normally used in war zones, and you said you will speak a little bit more about this. I'd like you to talk about the advantages of using this, which I find very interesting, particularly as you say. My son is speaking. Espera bocadinho, Félix, está bem? Particularly, as you say, to interpret violence as smoke silence for larger societal problems, okay? But I want also you to speak about the limits and the analytical dangers of this approach. As an example, you say that the aim of this shift is not to open the concept of war. And I know that I believe that you think there is also dangerous. Espera bocadinho, tá bem? And I think also you believe that there is some limits on doing this, on using this approach of war zones to non-war zones. And I want to speak, if you can speak a little bit about this. And the last comment, and also a question, and this is internationally, within the anti-racist movement, particularly the Black movement, there is a whole debate has risen around the defunding of the police and the abolition of prisons. And I want you, if you can, speak how this debate is developing in France and also in Switzerland. And when we talk about police violence, racism, and the prison system, because in the Portuguese reality, after the Black Lives Matter movement, this was not, I believe, such a big question inside of the Black movement and the anti-racist movement. But today, the debate about the defund of police or the abolition of prisons are a big debate when we speak about police violence. And it's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for your comments and questions. I would maybe ask Claske first to answer to those comments, and then we can open the debate. Would that be okay? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sure. And I was so focused on my own presentation that I forgot to thank you very much for inviting me and this opportunity to exchange. And I'm particularly happy about it because Portugal is not very much on my radar. So I'm also happy that we can share, this space where we can also, share also the things that we have in common or the questions. And what is interesting is that actually in Switzerland, there was a group of people working on police violence in Brazil, and so in Portuguese in the favelas, and they were talking about their situation, and the level of violence is beyond comparison, or I mean, it is very different, and we have to acknowledge that. But the feelings and the dynamics that were present were very much comparable. And in answer to your question, or to comment on that, Pedro, of that my goal is not to open up the whole concept of violence and to say that war is everywhere, but is really to say, okay, we have to interpret these situations as more than violence, because violence is as soon as you use violence, it is also legitimizing counter-violent or strategies that counter this violence, which are very violent in itself. And I think that is more my political goal behind it, is how we come to see the security and the safety of people in a larger context, where we are concerned about the safety and the security as much of racialized people as other people. And I would like to come back to that feeling of why. I mean, it's clear nobody says that Karim Boulouda, who died in 2010, was a good person, and many say, yeah, he was a criminal. I mean, if you choose a dangerous profession, this is what you can expect. And it is true that he was firing on the police, but I believe that like a large part of the anger that was about not taking care of this dead body, that okay, now he's dead, and you leave him there unattended, as if he doesn't count. And I think that was a large part of the anger. And now making a comparison to the situation in Switzerland, I think I'm going by your questions in a kind of like unorganized way, but they make sense in my head. About, like, I was wondering, why is it still important to speak about this case? I mean, this was 2010. So many things have happened since. We can speak about what happened last spring. And so it's really like, I think that for at least analyzing this instance taught me a lot about this racist mechanism of inverting aggressor and victim. And for me, that has been helpful also in a Swiss context, because I have left France 4 years ago. I now live in Switzerland. And since my research is every time also rooted in being part of activist networks, I don't follow the French context very closely, or my field has also shifted, and now I'm following a case in Switzerland where in 2021 a man that was clearly psychologically disturbed, I mean, he was very confused, was walking on the rails of a train station in Switzerland, and so somebody noticed him and was afraid that he would be in danger and maybe commit suicide, and so was concerned about the situation of this person. And so the person called the police, and while waiting for the police, he talked to this man, convinced him to get off the rails on the platform. And this was a young black or middle-aged black man. And when the police came, rather than following the protocol of how you deal with psychologically deranged people who are in stress, I mean, they came, the four of them. And so this person, out of his experience of racial profiling and paranoia, was so concerned by these four policemen that he actually ran onto them, and he had a knife, but this was just a knife that you take from your drawer. And so the police hit 3 times, hit this person, the person was dead and lay there on the floor for 6 minutes, and nobody attended to him. He was still alive, and so they saw that he was still alive, but nobody gave him first aid while they are trained to. And it was so interesting to hear like the recordings of the policemen, how they explained like what happened. And they were also saying like, well, actually we only cared for, you know, for our security. He was dangerous. We securitized the area, so it's only security language. And then they call the ambulance to say that the man is hurt, and so the ambulance then asks, okay, can you? So they exchange that he's been hit by a bullet. They exchange that he's that it's the police who fired the bullet, and then they ask, well, do you have any information that is helpful for us? And then the policeman answers, it's a person of color and he's underground. And so rather than being concerned about, I mean, giving information about where he is hurt, what they can do, or anything that has to do with the safety or saving a life that is in danger, they mention the aspect of that he's a racialized person. And so this really puzzles me, and I think you can find the kind of same, rather than seeing this as a person who's deranged, who's in danger and needs to be saved, or needs to be brought into security, while also guaranteeing the security of other people, they're actually only concerned about securitizing the environment because of a potential danger. While he's on the ground, he's clearly dying, and it's very unlikely that he's still a danger. So that to say that I think that you can actually apply this mechanism that I observed in many other cases. And so I think, I mean, there's always this question which I haven't completely resolved, but maybe it's not so important, about like, okay, racism and colonialism, they're different concepts, and in a way they're also very much connected. You asked about like that you have this debate about the colonial roots also, and the influences on the police force, and there's very important work done by Mathieu Rigouste in the case of France, which is called L'ennemi intérieur, where you can also see that a lot of recycling of ideas that were tested in the colonies were then used in France, and that's like the internal enemy, like from the colonial enemy then became the internal enemy. And that a lot of like what you see in France is, for example, that the type of police that is present in these neighborhoods is not the municipal police. So who is policing which kind of spaces is also very much linked to the marginalized and racialized areas are policed with different types of police, which are much more militarized. And so this militarized presence is very much part of people's daily lives, and which is very different in other in other areas of the city. So I think that is an important, an important element, and any kind of resistance or behavior against the police is interpreted as being anti-Republican. And now there is these neighborhoods. So you have a whole cartography in France of marginalization and racialized areas, which have specific policies, specific police. And now these are called des quartiers de reconquête républicaine. So neighborhoods of Republican reconquête. Probably in Portuguese it's easier to translate. Annabelle, how would you say reconquête?
I think in English it would be reconquests.
Yeah, but really, like, speaking in terms of conquest, and that's also framing the situation in a very militarized way, rather than acknowledging that there is a conflictual relationship, and people really have the feeling, and I think that is at the bottom of also this conflictual relationship, is that people feel that they are still treated as second-class citizens. And so they're wondering, like, they're trying to explain, why do I have this second-class position in society, and why am I not being cared for, and why do I not count? And so this is then what I really explored in my thesis, how they link that to colonial histories, and which is a topic that very much came up in the beginning, very slightly in 2005, but then after the terrorist attacks, it came up more, but with a huge backlash. And I think that like now some of the things that I worked on are kind of banal, talking that is like looking at this from a post-colonial perspective after Black Lives Matter has become much more mainstream, but it has been very difficult, to bring up the colonial question at that time in French universities was kind of like, what is she saying? There was a very much resistance against it, and also in the neighborhood, to make this topic discussable. That my colleagues, so we were a group, and my colleagues with whom I've been working, they were called by their friends, especially I've been working with a white older male. And so his friends, who were all established in the neighborhood, were calling him like, what are you doing? Are you crazy? You're creating conflict. And that is what we were, I think what we were blamed for, or is that by making this discussable, it was not about addressing a conflict, it was making conflict. And by making it discussable, making it visible, it was we who were creating like unrest in the area. And I think you can also find kind of this dynamic here of if you want to defend your rights, you're as a racialized person in general, if you want to defend your rights, you're seen as aggressive, and being on the seeing things from an activist perspective, from racialized activists in the neighborhood, I could really see kind of the power dynamics that were against them, which I would never have seen if I would have carried out interviews, because then the rapport would have been very different between me and the person. And so that's why I will go to your methods question now about, you're very right that I very much disagree with the University Basel guidelines, which I find very, they're following the rule book, but they're not based on relations. And I think that real ethics is based on kind of relationships that you establish, and in which you can agree on certain things. And I think that was a large part of carrying out my research, was around establishing these relationships and looking at what is ethical, what is fair, and never being certain, and always kind of searching for these. And so that was a big question that I was asking people: how would you like me to call you in my PhD? And so then they gave me the names, and a lot of them, because of this invisibilization in the past, for them it was important that I used their real first name. I didn't use any last names, which was then like the time in which I had to get this ethical clearance from the University of Basel was right in the time when the Minister of Higher Education wanted to have this analysis of all universities who are working with Islamogauchism. I don't know to what extent you followed this whole discussion in France, but there was a huge backlash after the terrorist attack and the killing of a geography teacher, Samuel Paty, who was killed by a Muslim father because he showed the cartoons that were published by Charlie Hebdo in class as a kind of discussion, and so this father didn't agree with it, and so organized like kind of a debate, like was politically mobilizing, and then one person killed Samuel Paty, and that has been like super traumatic, like as traumatic as the Charlie Hebdo killings, and then the Minister of Higher Education felt that the universities were infiltrated by pro-Islamic leftist people, and that they need to be cleared of this influence. So it was a kind of a witch hunt that was taking place. Anyway, to make the whole setting, and that was when I also felt kind of uncertain of this political climate, and also fearing that people might not exactly know what would happen, and that I also, so then I agreed on changing all the names and gave up but also didn't check again with the people on the field, because maybe that's part of my regret. But since I've been publishing in English, it's not a language that any of my the people that I worked with can understand. And so before doing my PhD, I gave a large presentation in a neighborhood, which was kind of validating what I would say in my thesis defense. But after that, and after my move to Switzerland, if I'm very honest, there was Corona, and I lost a bit this relation to the field, also because what I'm writing, a lot of people can't read. Like there's one article in French that I did share, but also because yeah, I have the feeling that everything we created, we so much co-created, and so I don't, it's like that. So I'm more keeping personal context, but less on a work level, which has been shifted to the Swiss context. Maybe I'll leave it there for the moment, and see also what questions arise from your side. I just put in a link on like the specificities of racialization in France, which I think are quite different in comparison to other contexts where I can comment on that later if there's interest to it.
Thank you so much, Claske. I would open now the floor for any questions that anyone in the room might have. Just raise your hands or unmute yourselves. And
well, I have like a lot of questions, but first I would like to maybe like let other people talk. But if you want, I can go first.
You can go first, Annabelle.
Okay. Well, thank you for the presentation, Claske. It was really insightful, and well, as I expected, it was really interesting, and I really enjoyed it. So thank you so much. Well, so maybe 2 or 3 questions just to start. The first one was more about the conflict in non-war settings. I know that it was kind of a talk that we had today, if you were talking more about that, or about violence in urban settings in France. And I would like to hear a bit more about what do you think, how could we frame, how could we theoretically frame conflict in a non-war settings, and what does it mean for war settings? So like, would it be a tension, and how we start thinking about that? And then maybe about so when you were talking about reconquest and all this very militarized vocabulary that they use when they talk about going into in this kind of neighborhood, I was automatically thinking about my work, obviously, because community-oriented policing in Latin America it's been also presented in a lot of cases as reconquests of those territories, saying that actually it's criminal groups dominating those territories. The state have been absent for a very long time, and now it's time to go back and take back the territory from those criminal groups, you know, as if the states had no choice in giving up those territories. So I find it very interesting to see that actually it's the same kind of languages that they use in France, like in Latin America. So for me, it was more maybe to, I don't know, I'm just gonna open. To what extent can we build bridges between, you know, Brazil, Latin America, and those kind of cases where they, creating new public security policies in which they try to take back the territory from criminal groups, and to what extent or how does it compare to what you saw in France? And maybe the last question is more about ethics, because it's also a subject that I love speaking about and talking about. So how would you conceptualize relationships ethics in comparison to, you know, more institutional and rules of the university ethics? Because for me, I don't know if you agree, but ethics made by universities basically, not generally, but part of them is a lot of rules to protect the university against legal threats or, you know, legal problems that may arise on the field. So how could we think about an ethics of relationships, of an ethics on the field for real, and how would you think about that? Thank you.
Oh, 1 second, Annabelle. I also have to address a family issue. I'll be back right away.
Before Claske answers the questions, Maria-João, do you have any questions that you would like to? Because I have a couple of questions as well, so I'm just trying to manage the time.
Sorry. No, I'm not sure. I just want to thank Claske for the fantastic presentation and for also bringing to us so many issues that are similar in many ways all over the world, we may say that. And when we look at the photos and when we look at the situations, we all remember many other situations and we cross over. But also the power of the urban heart and the expressions of those who are the victims and the populations who are face it in reality with the problems in local, to create new forms of expression, or sometimes there are new forms, but different forms of resilience and empowerment that sometimes are also used by other social groups. And that is perhaps the main challenge, how to keep real those concerns, those realities, and those intentions in the first place, as they were born, and not to be manipulated by others. And we have witnessed yesterday the elections in the Netherlands with the winning of the right-wing parties, and all these forces that are in connection, and the complexity of all that, and the need to look at those forms of expression.
Mm-hmm.
But this is not more a question, it's more a comment, because your photos, your visual images, and the power of visual anthropology and visual sociology is so powerful that bring us new ways of looking at the problems, and also bringing the voice of those who are involved, and without being manipulated. That is a real expression, and the importance of us as researchers to look at that and to think about the ethics forms of researching that. It's more like a comment, not a question.
Thank you, Maria João. Claske, do you want to answer the comments or comment on the comments?
Sure. And I'll try to keep it not long to really keep this idea of a conversation, but I think so. I don't think I want to say anything about war. I'm just saying that that we're attacking with colleagues kind of, and also with Priscil, this idea of a war-peace binary. And so if there's not war, there's peace, and there's not much to say. And if there's violence, we have to deal with it. And I think that is what I would like to open with my work, that because it was so interesting. We were talking with people in the neighborhood just after the second big terrorist attacks in November, when François Hollande declared war on Syria, and I organized kind of a public debate in the streets on, well, are we at war? And so most of them said, no, we're not at war, but we're not at peace either. And so this kind of non-war, non-peace situation reminded me of a lot of post-conflict settings, where we're post-conflict, but in the case of Bosnia, we're 30 years further and we're still post-conflict. And so what analytical tools do we have to understand this non-war, non-peace situation, and also acknowledging that a lot of people in our society don't live in a peace situation because they feel that their bodies are in danger, and it counts as much for undocumented migrants as it counts for also racialized people, and of course these dynamics often overlap. And so when you were asking, so that is what I'm interested in. How can we think about their lives in order for them to make the living and everyday a safer place, and then we have to acknowledge also this kind of very nationalist way of thinking about peace, that either a country is at peace or war, but actually we have to acknowledge that security and feelings of safety are much more spatialized and intersectional. And I think feminist thought has a lot to say about it. And this whole idea of like when we open up this idea of nation state thinking, acknowledging this whole idea of the interior enemy. And I think that is where Mathieu Rigouste is very helpful. And I think that is also where you can make a comparison between Latin American countries and also with the dynamics in France about this, that actually using the military for your internal civil population is what happens across the board. And it's been really interesting to follow like also some of the dynamics in Brazil, where some of the forces they've worked in the favelas were actually trained and armed for peacekeeping operations in Haiti, and that kind of which you also see in France is kind of this militarized police working against civilian population. And what does that say? If you use your military material on your own population, can you still say that you're not at war? And kind of questioning these binary oppositions. And I like your I like your thoughts on ethics. I think it's obvious. Yeah, it's certainly true that the university tries to protect itself. What I found very much at the University of Basel, but also at all the guidelines of the European Union, is that they're much more oriented towards like working with huge data sets, with natural sciences. And I think it's good that we think about protecting data, protecting people's identities, but I just think that it's so dominated by natural sciences that there's not a lot of place to rethink these questions in social sciences that work with qualitative methods, and that actually the same rules might not apply in the same way, and that they can actually be counterproductive for the relationships. Because I mean, if I would have applied all the guidelines at the time, the University of Grenoble didn't have them, so I didn't have to have signed consent forms, for example. If I would do it now, I would not be able to do it in the same way. And rather than establishing a relationship, such an informed consent form would actually strain the relationship, and it would not be possible to build the same ways. But also with this kind of like a participatory action research, you don't know in the beginning, you don't know your research question. That's what you're going to develop together, and so you're advancing completely in the unknown, and that in itself is incompatible with these ethical guidelines, where you have to state and you have to say, this is what my research is about, and yeah.
Thank you, Claske. I have a couple of questions myself, if you don't mind. And thank you so much for your presentation. I have learned so much today. So thank you for such brilliant presentation. So you, right at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that you have a decolonial and feminist approach to urban violence. And during your presentation was very clear the decolonial approach to your research, and I can see that you use Judith Butler in many ways, but I would like you to explore a little bit more on the feminist approach to this particular research. So how does it inform the research? You know, in what ways do you bring it to analyze, you know, to analyze your object, or you know, to create meanings around this topic. Another thing that I would like to say is that, just like Maria João, I love the fact that you presented mostly based on images, especially because if you talk about the way that young people use violence as a way of expressing themselves, because they cannot use the words, right? Or even if they use the words, they're not going to be listened to anyway. We as academics, we use words all the time, right? We mostly use words to express ourselves in the hopes of being listened to. And so recurring to images, and even thinking about the violence and the images of violence and how powerful they are, I believe that images are very powerful in this case as well. So I really enjoyed the fact that you brought the images, because they speak way more, and also shows the similarities that we have across countries, and even across many times topics, because it's not only youth violence. You might even see these sort of things happen with other phenomenon. So this was more a comment. The question is, you mentioned that when you were around, when we're talking about the names, the pseudonyms,
Yeah,
that it was not as problematic because you were published in English, and so your participants would probably not, they would not understand the papers. So I was wondering if you have published in a language that they understand. Are you planning on doing that? How would you approach that if you had to publish in the language that they would be able to provide feedback to? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with that last question because it's pretty straightforward. I haven't had the feeling that actually they were interested in what I was writing, and so it took a long time for me to figure out actually how to do participatory action research and this whole idea of co-researching. And then I found out they're not interested in research. And why should they be? I mean, this is what I am, and this is what I'm supposed to be. And also I had to learn that because I didn't come from research. I worked for a civil society organization for 15 years before starting my PhD, which was actually much more driven by a methodological question of how, like, if knowledge is power, how can knowledge play a role in social movements? That was actually my initial question. And so I had to learn to become a researcher, but it was not something they aspired at. And so then the question came, okay, how can we actually, rather than doing research together, where do our interests, where do we have shared interests? So I'm a researcher, or I'm supposed to be a researcher, and I come from that, and I am accountable to my PhD supervisor, my funders, and so I have to do that, but they have other accountabilities, and so it was really like looking for where do we have shared interests. And then every time, like, working in crisis situation creates this sense of necessity. And so Pedro was referring to my article where I'm explaining that there were three violent events that each create different kinds of necessities, but there was this two youth groups that fought, and so two youth that died. So there was this suffering and this mourning about these deaths, but also this anger about it. And then there was the attacks against Charlie Hebdo, and this whole feeling of a Muslim population that felt not heard. And so one violence was kind of, so this group that had formed to talk about the loss of their friends and stigmatization of the neighborhood, and then came Charlie Hebdo, and they all happened to be Muslim. And so the layers, you know, there were different layers, but these different events created a sense of urgency where people wanted to do something. And so I think that's where our interests collided, is that the reactions that they all have was creating public events. So finally, that was what we collaborated on, was creating public events, preparing them, thinking about people whom to invite, and so what was then publicly said was what I used in my research. But since we were really doing this together, and so I was then giving openness on what I was doing, but I never felt, so we created magazines together. I mean, we did a lot of things together, but I didn't have so I sent them things that I wrote, but I didn't have the feeling that it was of great interest. And so I also left it at that. My colleague, Eric Moifo, with whom I co-wrote that article that Pedro spoke about, he wrote a whole book about it. And so I think it's also okay that you have certain shared interests and others not necessarily. So about this question, like, what is feminist in my approach? And I think in Dorleen's work, I think you see it on the focus that she has on the body, and on the types of resistance which are non-verbal, but which are really like which are embodied, and also, so I try to have that, or at least that's, I think, what I learned, or what I took from feminist thought, this another part in which the body plays an important role. It's also this embodied feeling of difference, that you're all the time, you're differentiated based on the way your body looks, based on that you wear a headscarf, but which is also related to the body. And then finally, it is also when thinking about, okay, so how can we think about peace, and why do I say that they are not in a peaceful situation? I think it is also, like, I came to see peace also as an embodied experience. People feel whether they are at peace or not. And so if people were saying, no, I'm not at peace, they were telling about their situation, but this situation has very much impact on their bodies. And for example, the mother who lost their child in that violent event wrote a book which is called we're translated in English, it's that she felt as if her womb was ripped out. And so all these physical references on what it means to live with this violence is, I think, also like what I took from feminist writing. And then during your question, Sylvia, another question came up from Pedro, which I hadn't answered, and which was about also this kind of layered violence, and your question how like state violence and police brutality influences the violence among young people. And I never really thought about it. But if I'm thinking about it, I think what I would say is that what I find very particular for France, if I compare it to the Netherlands or to Switzerland, is that the problems are identified as spatial problems. And so this spatial identity of belonging to a certain neighborhood is extremely strong. And I think that is what the police, because they treat these neighborhoods as exceptional spaces, I think that they reinforce then the sense of that you have to defend it. And I think that is what the police does, is defend this spatial identity. And that's also what played the role in this fight, is that people from one neighborhood were coming in the other neighborhood, and this idea that they had to defend the neighborhood against outsiders is something that plays a strong role for more marginalized men. But yeah, it's a bit indirect of a relationship, but there's an interesting Dutch sociologist who had two pictures, and he said, like, in the Dutch context, you would frame it like as a race issue, or like race riots, and in the context of France, you would say it's like it's about neighborhood violence, and so the spatialization is very strong in France because of its specific history of urbanization, with creating these large social housing neighborhoods at the peripheries of cities, which physically concentrates a socioeconomically disadvantaged population, which you have, I think, which is different in other settings. And at the same time, it also creates a possibility of organization and identification, which can become a political tool. And so there are also a lot of political parties who try to politicize around this violence. So it's not only negative, it is also used in terms of agency and political mobilization. And that is also where my answer goes about, like, how is racialization specific in France? Is it Arabs? Is it Muslims? Is it Blacks? And that is what is interesting, is that this I think that racialized works very well in the French context, because it is all this together, and they identify together as des jeunes des quartiers. And so being from the same spatial background creates a kind of political affiliation and identification, which you have less so, at least in the Swiss context, where that is not so important. And then the difference between Arabs and Blacks, which of course is also there in France, but much less so. People recognize another person coming from a marginalized neighborhood, and they have similar codes, similar references, and also some kind of solidarity, because a lot of these political movements that have existed over the last years from these neighborhoods have organized around police violence, and then at time it is a Black person who's considered, like with Adama Traoré, and then it's an older Muslim man, it's an Arab, yeah, there's a important political identification taking place there.
Thank you so much, Claske, for that. We still have 5 minutes. So does anyone want to ask like something else? Any last comment or question? No? All right. Thank you so much, Claske, for your brilliant presentation. Thank you so much, Pedro, for commenting on the presentation. And obviously, thank you very much for Annabelle and Maria João for organizing these webinars. I personally learned a lot today. And so thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for this moment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really nice. I think we learned a lot. And I mean, it's obviously there are a lot of work to do again still on this topic, but yeah, I'm really interested in those discussions. So really, thank you so much for bringing it here.
Yes, I also would like to thank Claske for the presentation and for the fantastic work, and let's hope that we can keep in collaboration in this group, and thank you for this opportunity. And also thank you, Pedro, for the comments and for being available for this role. And also to Sylvia for being here and to moderate. It's a pleasure also. And thank you for all.
Thank you all also.